Addiction is not a choice. I'm not here to say I know the answers to addiction, that I have the right perspective. I don't think that there is one perspective on addiction. But the idea that addiction is a choice is something that I've run into over and over on my journey with addictions. And that's okay, you know? A lot of the people who say those things just don't know. They just don't know. And that's okay. You know, can't take these things personally. But recently I've run into a number of examples of people within the self-help world, within the coaching world, within the personal development world who are also adopting this idea. People who even struggle with addiction in their own lives at some point. Perhaps for them there was this moment of clarity where they made a choice and they never went back, and it was willpower over compulsion. Perhaps that's the case. Everyone's experience is different. But from my experience and from the people I've seen in my life and I've watched struggle with addiction, it's not a choice. And to be coming up against this in the world of personal development and healing, this idea of, well, the best way to quit smoking is just to stop smoking and not smoke anymore. This really it's disappointing to me. It's frustrating to me. Because addiction is one of the most important and significant issues of our time. People are seeking deep healing, and it's impossible to seek deep healing without at some point coming face to face with our own addictions. And no one would say to someone with any sort of other compulsion, you know, whether it's a food addiction or obsessive compulsive disorder, no one would say to that person, oh, well, why don't you just stop washing your hands? Why don't you just stop checking the door 3 times? Why can't you just stop? It's just willpower. Just stop doing it, right? No one says that. No one would think to say that. That would be considered kind of a ridiculous thing to say. It would be considered ridiculous to tell someone who is an agoraphobic to just leave their house. Like, can you just stop staying in your house? You know, to go to a hoarder and say, oh, why don't you just stop collecting old newspapers? It's that simple, just stop. Addiction's the same way. It's a compulsion. These are all different forms of compulsion. And to someone who's struggling with addiction, what that means, from my perspective, is that they're struggling with this never-ending internal conflict about how they know what they should do or want to do, but they can't do it. And that is usually rooted in deep trauma, deep pain, deep wounding, and suggests that the answer is to just stop. Just stop. You know, it's that simple. Just stop and don't look back. That tells me that there's a lot of need for new and different approaches to dealing with addiction. There's a lot of need for a softer, more compassionate approach. There's a lot of need for an approach to addiction that gets rid of the labels of relapse. Words like relapse. Oh, I relapsed. There's so much shame in that. And that shame that comes from these ways of thinking, that, oh, you can just stop. That shame makes the cycle that much more painful and that much more difficult. And what I've learned in my struggles with addiction is that love, self-love, is the only answer. I mean, you gotta love yourself when you're abstaining. You gotta be patient with yourself, compassionate with yourself when you're abstaining. And when you're using, you gotta be equally compassionate with yourself and patient with yourself. and not label those times spent sober. If you were sober for a couple weeks or a couple months and then you quote relapse, to not label that as a failure, to not label that as a mistake, to not label that as a waste. Every phase of the cycle, every part, when you're using and when you're not using, is a critical part of the journey of healing. And if we can learn to approach it as such, to honor it as such, and to have compassion with ourselves no matter where we are in those cycles, then those cycles can soften and we can soften. And over time, we can do the deep healing that ultimately has to occur in order for that moment of convergence to come, that moment to come where you can put it down and not look back. And when that happens, it's not a choice. It's an arrival. It's a conclusion. Because that hungry ghost within us that has been driving these compulsive behaviors, that hungry ghost is no longer there. It's no longer there. And I believe that's true healing. That's true overcoming of addiction. I went to a lot of 12-step meetings at a time in my life, and the number of people I saw in those meetings who had been coming for 10, 15, 20 plus years, and they all said the same thing: these are the meetings that only keep me from using. If someone's been sober for 20 years, but it's still a struggle not to use, then something is still not healed. I'm not someone who believes a once an addict, always an addict. I don't believe that. I believe we are all addicts and we are all wounded, and that we are seeking a deeper level of healing at this time on the earth. People are crying out. People are awakening to their own internal spiritual poverty. People are awakening to their wounds, awakening to the wounds that they inherited from their ancestors, awakening to the wounds that they feel within themselves that actually exist outside themselves, and awakening to the fact that many of their compulsive behaviors, even if they're socially acceptable ones that aren't usually considered addictions, that these compulsive behaviors are coping mechanisms. And that in order to change those behaviors, they have to look at the deeper wounding. And so that's where I'm at on my journey, going through those cycles and learning to have more compassion and patience. If you're struggling with addiction, I just want to say I understand and I have compassion for you. And I think it's possible for us to reframe these things, to reframe them from a negative problem in our lives into an opportunity for personal transformation. And sometimes that transformation takes decades, but that's okay, because it's all part of the journey, all part of the spiritual path, all part of the healing process. To allow ourselves to be right where we are, to allow ourselves to be loved, and to allow ourselves to be imperfect. The more we can do this, the more we can come to the... Some big bug just flew at me. The more we do this, the more we can... the more we can sink into the deeper wounds that we're carrying. And the more we can start to work through them and heal them, truly transmute them and transform them, one little piece at a time. And in this way, our journey of addiction, our journey of being sober and then relapsing, and then being sober and then relapsing, these things can be an opportunity to discover more clearly the wounds that we carry, and to heal them more deeply, and to move more and more towards wholeness and more towards connection with ourself and with life and with spirit. So I'm thankful for my addictions. And I'm thankful for these cycles. And I'm thankful to be on the earth at a time where these understandings are becoming more clear and more culturally accepted. And I'm thankful for this opportunity to share this with whoever might be watching or listening. Things are going to get better. And we are more blessed than we usually realize.